Most folks who speak about Western values mean well. However, sadly, it has also become coded language for something more sinister that leads to xenophobia and racism. But what do you think? Comment me, brah.
Okay, but not because you told me to.
On the 30th of August, 2021, the United States military withdrew from its 20-year presence in Afghanistan, followed closely by the Islamic militant group the Taliban, who easily established control over the nation. The collapse of the Republican government in Kabul was so swift and simple, even after 20 years of financial, military, and diplomatic support from the United States, that the whole Afghanistan war is now considered by many to be one of the worst geopolitical miscalculations the United States has ever made. As President Biden noted in his address to the nation afterwards,
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. We could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference. Here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them.
why is it that, when the chips were down, so to speak, the majority of the Afghan military threw down their arms and fled? We'll come back to that question. But how is it that the intelligentsia, the experts in the Department of Defense and the State Department, as well as elite academia, blundered so badly? To answer that question, we have to rediscover some forgotten basics of sociology. The anthropologist Ralph Linton, who pioneered the idea of basic personality types alongside psychologist Abram Cardener, postulated that the individual's early experiences exert a lasting effect upon his personality. Similar experiences will tend to produce similar personality configurations. Techniques which the members of a society use to care and rear children are culturally patterned and will tend to be similar, though not identical, within a society. These child-rearing practices vary between societies, and so it follows that members of any given society will tend to have elements of early experience in common. Therefore, they will tend to have elements of personality in common. Since these child-rearing experiences differ between societies, so will the personality types. They caveat that this basic personality type does not correspond to the total personality of the individual, but rather to the projective systems which are basic to the individual's personality configuration. Thus, the same basic personality type may be reflected in many different total personality configurations. As anthropologist Raphael Patai further caveats these observations, personality thus described is only the statistically most significant one in the group studied, and further expands on Linton and Gardiner that, I would therefore venture to define national character as the sum total of the motives, traits, beliefs, and values shared by the plurality of a national population. Since the personality of the plurality in a given population can also be designated as the model personality, it appears that national character can be equated with model personality.
Chào anh em là con gái miền Tây mới lên thành phố được có mấy ngày.
This may all seem very obvious. Of course, humans have all seen these differences as they travel to foreign places, meet their people, witness their artistic expression, or engage with their thinkers. But this tidy syllogism gives us a concise idea as to why that may be, just in case. Noticing differences between human societies due to their influences is neither wrong nor surprising. It's part of what makes the world a fun place to wonder. And people have been wondering and noticing differences and comparing in the Western world since Herodotus. But in modern America, swaddled as we are in a sense of cultural homogeneity, some of us have slowly diminished this reality in our minds until we forget that it existed at all. This led us, in my opinion, to an incredibly naive view of the world around us, a naivete which then, comfortably smug in its lack of knowledge, became actively hostile to reality. And there is no better example of this high-handed condescension towards reality itself than YouTuber Mr. Beat.
I'm Mr. Beat. I'm here in the Western world where we do Western things and we have Western values. You know what Western values are, right?
Mr. Beat is a high school history teacher who makes educational content with a particular focus on civics. In a video entitled Western Values Explained, he lays out a case for why he doesn't like the term.
Let's just call them values.
It's important to mention that one of the strongest aspects of Mr. Beat's critique is how slippery it can be to define Western values. Many people use the phrase in order to link their political ideas to a sense of gravitas and heritage, which leads to it becoming an unwieldy bundle of imprecise and inconsistently applied ideas bumping into each other and mixing together as history unfolds. Like any human society, Western society is difficult to statically define. So difficult that we study it in college, as Mr. Beat sullenly observes.
After all, I spent at least hundreds of hours studying for overpriced Western civilization classes I took in college. And yet, years later, I still found myself Googling what the West actually was.
But oddly enough, Mr. Beat solves this problem better than many who actively promote the idea.
More than anything, Western values have been most influenced by the big three: Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian culture.
Even reform movements like Protestantism, skeptical of the goodness of human reason, were responding to a perceived outsized influence of Greek philosophy over Christianity. The Enlightenment did the opposite. I love this definition. It's specific enough to indicate the distinction between what informed the West versus other regions, while still broad enough to encompass the scope of historical complexity. It's beautiful. Good job, Mr. Beat. You should have quit while you were ahead. But unfortunately, he continues.
But to assume those three influences didn't overlap with other influences outside of the West is silly. For example, there are quite a bit of similarities when it comes to Western and Eastern religions. And here's another thing. When I researched examples of so-called Western values, I began to realize that these are values that most human beings have, whether they live in the West or not. The West doesn't, quote, own these values.
Certainly, there are values shared by most societies, like filial piety. But even then, there are exceptions. Most is the strongest word we can plausibly use here. Communists don't value private property. Monarchists don't care about democratic representation. And these differences aren't because of ignorance or an education gap. Vladimir Lenin was not lacking in formal education. There are reasons, cultural, philosophical, economic, historical, and religious, that people think these ways, wrong, right, and indifferent. But to give him the benefit of the doubt, perhaps it would be more agreeable to Mr. Beat if the statement was rephrased to say, different civilizations have different values hierarchies, which would result in different child-rearing practices and thus different national characters. For example, American filial piety, based on the Ten Commandments, but checked by a strong cultural emphasis on the individual, looks somewhat different than the Confucian communitarian Chinese version. The values may be broadly the same, but subtle differences in its origin, the concepts prioritized alongside it, and the way a culture then practices and instills this value leads to fairly large differences, large enough for even Mr. Beat to pay lip service to.
I mean, I do get their points, especially when you look at Sharia law and its effect on how women, the LGBTQ community, and atheists are treated in places like Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. But then you're ignoring all the reform movements within those countries. For example, some within the Sawa movement in Saudi Arabia have actively called for more rights for women over the past few decades. The Sawa movement in Saudi Arabia have actively called for more rights for women over the past few decades.
I don't want to seem mean-spirited to this guy, but this is such a glaring error, pronounced with such self-assurance that I was legitimately thrown off by it. I thought there must be some mistake and he's referring to some other Saudi reform movement, also called Sahwa. I mean, this guy has a whole video where he picks apart a casual conversation on Joe Rogan for logical fallacies for an hour, and he couldn't even Google this. This is a really exceptionally sloppy mistake to make, especially for the strident claims he's making here. My mind was honestly really kind of blown by it, but anyway, yeah, not to be mean, but damn.
Shame on you.
Now that that's off my chest, he's referring to this Sahwa movement. Sahwa movement, awakening movement, or Al-Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the Islamic awakening, was a movement in Saudi Arabia from 1960 to 1980, which advocated for incorporating more reliance on Wahhabi principles into Saudi society. The most noticeable effects of this movement were significant restrictions on women's rights, religious freedom, and personal liberties. The movement's core doctrines were shaped by the fundamentalist tenets of Qutbism, such as theological denunciations of democracy and the belief that contemporary governments of the Muslim world had apostatized. I realize it's Wikipedia, but that just kind of shows you how easy this could have been to get right, or to just refrain from being wrong. This guy is a high school teacher. I mean, in other words, the Sahwa movement was a reform movement. He got that right. And it was against the Saudi royalty. He got that right. But they opposed Western influence. And the Saudi royal family they thought were Western stooges. Here's what one of their dissidents, now exiled from Saudi Arabia, Dr. Said al-Faqih, had to say about the cultural differences Mr. Beat uses his movement to claim don't exist. I would not be exaggerating if I say hate to America and Saudi Arabia is more than hate to America and Palestine. The reason for that, and that's why I say there's a complete failure of American human intelligence in Saudi Arabia, has got a lot to do with Saudi politics, Saudi culture, the Saudi way of life, and the current and recent events in the country. It goes like this. You've got a fairly religious country, many people are devout Muslims, and they look at their land as a holy land, a sacred land prohibited from non-Muslim groups or units or buddies to settle on it, let alone military units with domination. So even if you are not military, even if you are a community staying alone in a non-Muslim community, according to Muslim text, you are not allowed to settle in the Arabian Peninsula. But if it is a military unit, then it is a huge and massive insult and humiliation to Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula to accept this sort of presence. It's very confusing that Mr. Beat chose this example. It's so completely the reverse of what he's trying to say. He could have chosen, say, Harakat al-Istiqlal or Tayar al-Mustaqbal in Lebanon, who actually, roughly, do represent liberal dissidents in the Middle East, in that they officially endorse a secular government, although they are still largely tied to religious sects. And that's in Lebanon, by the way, the only country in the region to have a true, if very weak, parliamentary government and some form of constitutional pluralism. So when Mr. Beat says that,
I don't think Murray and Ferguson mean harm, but often when they talk about the values of the so-called Islamic world, we hear only about the extremists.
Keep in mind that even the reform movement he himself mentions is based on anti-Western sentiments. We're not talking about cherry-picking some fringe subset to represent the whole. We're looking at the institutions, influences, and values which constitute the regional character. In the Middle East, as in the West, these can be misinterpreted and misconstrued, as Mr. Beat has done here. That doesn't mean they don't exist. But the point Mr. Beat is trying to make is that we shouldn't be too quick to generalize, because people groups are not a monolith. Good thing that, as Patai noted, we are only sociologically observing the most statistically significant model personality. It, of course, would be unreasonable to suppose that every single person shares the exact same personality profile, and as far as I know, nobody in this discussion has ever claimed that. Also, this does not invalidate the simple observation that there are trends. You have to know a little bit about the place before you speak about it, though, so I understand the hesitancy Mr. Beat shows. This may be why he says,
this woman from Jordan calls out Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, after he talks about spreading Western values around the world.
Earlier on in your presentation, you spoke about Western values and bringing Western values to the rest of the world. And I don't want to come across as the chippy foreigner, but please can you move beyond that language and recognize that they're not exclusively Western values. You know, respecting human life and the rule of law. These are also Muslim values. These are values that go across the world. And as an international corporation with such a global reach, I would really appreciate it if you would lead the way by moving beyond that terminology.
This clip really blew me away, because this lady knows that she's not being forthright with the Western audience here, and she's banking on their own lack of knowledge. She knows that there is not freedom of speech in Jordan where it counts, criticism of the king and the royal family, and there isn't democratic representation where it counts, when they might go against the king. And although Christians and non-believers are treated comparatively well in Jordan, the state is still Islamic, lended legitimacy by the Hashemite bloodline of Muhammad. And while many Jordanians do share her more progressive attitudes, they know this situation. The crazy thing is, Jordan, by Middle Eastern standards, is pretty progressive. And yet many Jordanians value the monarchy, love King Abdullah, desire the primacy of Islam in public life, and agree with the restrictions on speech considered blasphemous or treasonous. They love it in large part precisely because it is not Western. It is viewed as a renunciation of what they consider to be the decadent and detached Western mindset. I would give you a rough estimate of how the numbers break down, but the proportions of the populations who believe this or that is very difficult to genuinely know, because Islam and the monarchy are so well protected by the system in Jordan. If you, like Mr. Beat, fear that any mention or acknowledgement of these differences are simply
tens of millions of people out there who think that their Western values make them better people than those with the non-Western values.
If it makes any difference to you, when it comes to Jordan, I actually like King Abdullah as a person, and I can see why many Jordanians would too. The whole warrior king thing he's got going on is pretty awesome, actually. I understand why certain Islamic viewpoints oppose Western-style elections, secular government, and free speech. I'm not mad about it. It makes most of them happy, it feels authentic to them according to their own heritage and traditions, and I personally don't feel that every place needs to share my values. It doesn't surprise me that a majority Muslim society, which has been historically shaped by Islam, would want that cultural reality to be reflected in an Islamic-style government. I don't think that this is some dig on them. I debated with the first Jordanian I ever met about polygamy. It was a fun and frank, if kind of surprising, conversation. I found it enjoyable. He offered a genuinely foreign perspective. He also did me the great courtesy of telling me his true thoughts, despite the potential irritation it may have caused me as a Westerner. He was thoughtful and well-spoken, and at the end of the conversation, although we didn't agree, it was no harm to me. I just went back to the States. Really and truly, it's no skin off my nose, and in the ideal world, none off of his either. Many Jordanians don't agree with him, probably the Jordanian lady we heard from earlier. But that's something that country will have to figure out for itself amongst the people who live there and whose cultural roots are from there. An internal cultural dialogue that country ought to have in its own community. In my opinion, it would be very rude, uncultured even, for me to presume to insert myself into that dialogue, to presume to dictate the right and wrong answers to the people who live in their country and know the nuances of their country as to what would be best for them going forward.
It's very rude.
Let alone try to persuade them at gunpoint. That would be plain bad form. A truly non-Western perspective, not just Middle Eastern, by the way, but East or South Asian or Sub-Saharan, will often provoke us to consider the world differently, and even if we don't agree, lead us to a more nuanced perspective on how we understand the world. For example, I highly recommend Ryan Chapman's video on the difference between the political philosophy of the United States and China. There is so much difference here, if we really take the time to examine it. And again, respect or acknowledgement of insight does not ultimately mean agreement or even moral approval. What do I personally prefer? The Western values, hands down. How much of that is innate in-group preference? Some. How much of it is just objectively better? Some. Other cultural groups have some sensibilities which I think are better than standard modern Western values. You won't catch Arabs putting their parents into a nursing home. There are some practices which I can see the logic in, but wouldn't want to live under myself, like monarchy. Some which I consider to be strange or illogical, even if harmless, like soccer. And others that I think are downright evil, like the one-child policy. In general, though, I'd agree with this statement by President Obama when asked about a parallel concept, American exceptionalism, in 2009.
I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. I'm enormously proud of my country and its role and history in the world. And I think that we have a core set of values that are enshrined in our Constitution, in our body of law, in our democratic practices, in our belief in free speech and equality, that, though imperfect, are exceptional. Now, the fact that I am very proud of my country and I think that we've got a whole lot to offer the world does not lessen my interest in recognizing the value and wonderful qualities of other countries, or recognizing that we're not always going to be right, or that other people may have good ideas.
Sounds good to me, but that's just my opinion. Have whatever opinion you want. It's a free country after all. Just make sure to keep it consistent with reality. Let's tie up some loose ends.
Perhaps continuing to label stuff in society that we like, quote, Western values, is damaging public discourse and oversimplifying society.
It's almost always possible to be more precise, but for some matters such as sociology or cultural comparison, or even social studies, which Mr. Beat supposedly teaches, general metrics, provided that they are truly consistent with the details, are suitable, necessary, and good. Aristotle makes this observation at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. We'll only need our claims to be as explicit and detailed as the underlying material allows. We mustn't demand precision in the same way in all areas of discourse, just as we don't in things made by craftsmen. Criticizing a genre of study which is designed to be broad because it is broad is always possible. It's easy. It also misses the point. Legitimate criticism should come from whether or not the study is actually consistent with the truth in detail. Mr. Beat, while saying people are oversimplifying, is himself oversimplifying. He continues.
I believe that calling values Western does more harm than good. No one has to own values, and geotagging them is counterproductive. It can lead to nationalism and xenophobia. Basically, we all love most of these things. Let's just stop being lazy with our language and making it us versus them.
Okay, listen. I don't think Mr. Beat means any harm. But his hesitancy to observe very real cultural differences between people groups shared by many of our decision makers has led to foreign policy of the exact nature he claims to oppose.
Another thing that can be problematic is when folks say Western values are far superior to all other values, to a point where forcibly spreading them around the world is okay.
If Mr. Beat's claim that there is nothing distinctive about the Western values were true, then either there would be no need to export them, or any aberration from them would be a violation of norms so great that fighting them would be an obvious and quick fix. But Mr. Beat insists that Western values are nothing distinctive while at the same time opposing regime change wars. And I agree with him in general on the foreign wars part, but his perspective on this is pretty cognitively dissonant. Perhaps not him, perhaps, but a lot of Americans are afraid to notice differences between ourselves and other cultures because they're afraid of seeming xenophobic. So they act like the world is full of people whose value set is exactly like ours. It's an oddly sheltered way to think. People don't even realize that by proclaiming this view, they're indicating a pretty substantial lack of knowledge about the wider world, the sort Mr. Beat has shown in this exact video respecting the Middle East. The lack of knowledge runs so deep that it isn't even self-aware. For them, other cultures are an unknown unknown, but more tellingly, it also shows a strange small-mindedness because the presumption is weirdly that in order to be good, you must be into women's liberation or secular government or democracy.
And pointing to extremists as representative of an entire religion has often been a convenient way to discredit an entire country or culture.
Why would it be necessarily discrediting to observe that Middle Eastern institutions are undemocratic? I really don't care, do you? The presumption that it is inherently discrediting seems a little wet behind the ears. We can't, according to this logic, notice the practices around the world we don't like because since our own cultural view is essentially synonymous with absolute good, we can't tolerate the thought that foreigners wouldn't see the world in our way. It's such an interesting paradox of narrow-mindedness. And because of this dissonance, we have to lie to ourselves because our way is the only way. So observing the patriarchal nature of the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa would, of course, be racist or xenophobic. Because they think that strict and rigid patriarchy is an ultimate evil, they become anxious lest they indict different cultures for it. But at the end of the day, it is actually both patronizing, assuming that if a society holds a non-Western cultural viewpoint, it must necessarily be deficient, not just different, and childish because it remains willfully ignorant of the world in order to justify its own simplicity. For an example of this thinking in action, done a lot more eloquently than Mr. Beat, to be fair, look at President George W. Bush's justification of the Afghanistan war.
We've taken a 200-year journey toward inclusion and justice, and this makes us patient and understanding as other nations are at different stages of this journey. There are, however, essential principles common to every successful society in every culture. Successful societies limit the power of the state and the power of the military so that governments respond to the will of the people and not the will of the elite. Successful societies protect freedom with the consistent and impartial rule of law instead of selectively applying the law to punish political opponents. Successful societies allow room for healthy civic institutions, for political parties and labor unions and independent newspapers and broadcast media. Successful societies guarantee religious liberty, the right to serve and honor God without fear of persecution. Successful societies privatize their economies and secure the rights of property. They prohibit and punish official corruption and invest in the health and education of their people. They recognize the rights of women. And instead of directing hatred and resentment against others, successful societies appeal to the hopes of their own people.
I appreciate President Bush's nod to the organic development of our system. The stability of the American Republic has depended more, I think, than many Americans themselves appreciate, on a heavy-footed historical unfolding of individual events, personalities, movements, and chance. The roots of the American order run far deeper than 1776. As Mr. Beat noted, they stretch back to Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. If you ever get a chance to visit the U.S. Capitol, you'll see there a copy of the Magna Carta signed by King John in 1215. This was given to our people as a gift from England, paying homage to the English roots of our founding. Just as the English nobles had constrained the executive power, King John, so too did we, King George III. It would have been inconceivable to those nobles in 1215 that the United States, or any country like it, would ever exist. And yet, as the chance of history would have it, this scrappy English distaste for tyranny, marinating in the English mind for hundreds of years, developed very gradually into our own Constitution of 1789. The United States, and the whole cultural West for that matter, is not an abstraction, decreed from on high, as the final stage of man and the end of history. I also agree with the president's assessment almost completely when considering the successes of the United States. I think what he's doing is providing a pretty fair theory for why we have been so successful. It's very American and broadly Western in its value set. But it would seem that President Bush agrees with Mr. Beat that we shouldn't aim to distinguish these values. Everybody, at the end of the day, must truly want to be like us. We, and our form of government, as it is currently constituted, seems to the president to be the zenith of human society and all history and humanity, and so it is only reasonable to suspect that the hearts of every Afghani must be Texan, deeply and truly, waiting to be set free. So President Bush continues.
These vital principles are being applied in the nations of Afghanistan and Iraq. With the steady leadership of President Karzai, the people of Afghanistan are building a modern and peaceful government. Next month, 500 delegates will convene a National Assembly in Kabul to approve a new Afghan constitution. The proposed draft would establish a bicameral parliament, will set national elections next year, and recognize Afghanistan's Muslim identity while protecting the rights of all citizens. Afghanistan faces continuing economic and security challenges. It will face those challenges as a free and stable democracy.
This speech was given in November of 2003 to the National Endowment for Democracy, 19 years before President Biden's withdrawal. Over the course of the 20-year conflict, the longest in United States history, 2,456 American servicemen died and 20,752 were wounded in action. For those Americans, this miscalculation was not a harmless, ethereal mistake made from the comfortable ivory towers of academia, which can afford to be so detached from reality. It was a failure, paid for with life and limb. This case study illustrates the truth known intuitively, sociologically, and historically. At the end of the war, after all of that effort was wasted, as Afghanistan defaulted to its illiberal government, It seems to me the most modest, intellectually cautious proposal to say that the Afghani people reject Western values. To deny this fact is to, at a certain point, simply be in denial.